Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi everyone, we are from group 2 and we're here to present our presentation about audit sampling for tests of controls and substantive tests of transactions. But first of all, I need to introduce my group members. We have 3 members. First is Bunga Adinda Putri, and we have me, Cindy Nabila Andri, and then we have Gina Maria Harut. The first part is the concept of representative sampling that will be presented by me. A representative samples is one of which the characteristics in the sample are approximately the same as those of populations. This means that these sample items are similar to the items not sampled. In practice, auditors never know whether a sample is representative, even after all testing is complete. However, auditors can increase the likelihood of sample being representative by using care in designing the sampling process, sample selection, and evaluation of sample results. A sample results can lead to incorrect conclusion due to the sampling error or non-sampling error. Next. The risk of these two types of errors occurring is called sampling risk and non-sampling risk. Sampling risk is the risk that an auditor reach an incorrect conclusion because the sample is not representative of the population. Auditors have two ways of control sample risk. The first one is adjust the sample size. Increasing sample size reduce sampling risk and vice versa. At one extreme, a sample of all items of all population has zero sampling risk. At the other extreme, a sample of one or two items has an extremely high sampling risk. Second is use an appropriate method of selecting sample items from the population. Using an appropriate sample selection method increase the likelihood of representativeness. This does not eliminate or even reduce sampling risk, but it does allow the auditor to measure the risk associated with a given sample if statistical method of sample selection and evaluations are used. Next is we're going to talk about non-sampling risk. Non-sampling risk is the risk that the auditor reach an incorrect conclusion for any reason not related to sampling risk. The two causes of non-sampling risks are first, the auditor's failure. Second is inappropriate or ineffective audit procedures. Next is distinguish between statistical and non-statistical sampling and between probabilistic and non-probabilistic sample selections. For the statistical versus non-statistical sampling, audit sampling methods can be divided into two broad categories: statistical sampling and non-statistical sampling. These categories are similar in that they're both involved in three phases. First is plan the sample. Two, select the sample and perform the test. Third is evaluate the result. The purpose of planning the sample is to make sure that the audit tests are performed in a manner that provides the desired sampling risk and minimize the likelihood of non-sampling error. Assume that an auditor selects a sample of 100 duplicate sales invoice from a population and tests each to determine whether a shipping document is attached and determines that there are three exceptions. Let's look at these actions step by step. The action is first decide that a sample size of 100 is needed. That is the step of plan the sample. Next, for the select the sample and perform the test, the action that we did is decide which 100 items to select from the population and then perform the audit procedure for each of the 100 items and determine that there are that there are 3 exceptions. And the last step is evaluate the results. The action that we did is reach the conclusions about the likely exception rate in the total. Statistically sampling differs from non-statistical sampling in that by applying mathematical rules, auditors can quantify or measure sampling rates in planning the sample and in evaluating the results. In non-statistical samplings, auditors do not quantify the sampling risk. Next. Next, we're going to talk about the probabilistic versus non-probabilistic sample selection. When using probabilistic sample selections, the auditors randomly select items such that each population's item has a known probability of being included in the sample. This process requires a great care and use of one of several methods discussed shortly. In non-probabilistic sample selection, the auditor selects sample items using non-probabilistic methods that approximate a random sampling approach. Auditors can use one of several non-probabilistic sample selection methods. Next, we're going to talk about how to apply statistical and non-statistical sampling in practice and sample selection methods. Auditing standards permit auditors to use either statistical or non-statistical sampling method. When statistical sampling is used, the sample must be probabilistic one, and appropriate statistical evaluation method must be used with the sample results to make the sampling computations. Auditors may make non-statistical evaluations when using probabilistic selection, but it's never acceptable to evaluate a non-probabilistic sample using statistical methods. Next, the third and the fourth part will be presented by Bunga.
Okay, thank you. The third point is select sample using probabilistic and non-probabilistic methods. Probabilistic sample selection methods include the following. The first one is simple random sample selection. The second one is systematic sample selection. And the third one is probability proportional to size sample selection. And the non-probabilistic sample selection methods include, the first one is haphazard sample selection, and the second one is block sample selection. Auditors can also use probabilistic methods even when using non-statistical sampling. Okay, the probabilistic sample selection methods. The first one we got in here is simple random sample selection. In the simple random sample selection, every possible combination of population items has an equal chance of being included in the sample. When auditors obtain a random sample, they must use a method that ensures all items in the population have an equal chance of selection. And then this is systemic sample selection. In systemic sample selection, or also called a systematic sampling, the auditors calculates an interval and then selects the items for the sample based on the size of the interval. The interval is determined by dividing the population size by the desired sample size. The advantage of systematic selection is its ease of use. Meanwhile, the concern with systematic selection is the possibility of bias. And then probability proportional to size and stratified sample selection. In many auditing situations, it is advantage to select samples that emphasize population items with larger recorded amounts. There are two ways to obtain such samples. The first one is take a sample in which the probability of selecting any individual population items is proportional to its recorded amount. The second one is divide the population into subpopulation, usually by dollar size, and take larger sample from the subpopulation with larger size. And then the non-probabilistic sample selection methods are those that don't meet the technical requirements for probabilistic sample selection. The first one, as we know, haphazard sample selection, the selection of items without any conscious bias by the auditor. The second one is block sample selection. Auditors select the first items in a block and then the remainder of the block is chosen in sequence. The fourth point is audit sampling for exception rates. Auditors use sampling for tests of controls and substantive tests of transaction to determine whether controls are operating effectively and whether the rate of the monetary errors is below the tolerable limits. So there are three types of exception in population of accounting data. The first one is deviation from the client's established controls. The second one is monetary misstatements in population of transaction data. The third is monetary misstatements in population of account balance details. The exception rate in a sample is used to estimate the exception rate in the entire population, meaning it is the auditor's best estimate of the population exception rate because the exception rate is based on the sample. There is a significant likelihood that the sample exception rate differs from the actual population exception rate. This difference is called the sampling error. The auditor is concerned with both the estimate of the sampling errors and the reliability of the estimate, called sampling risk. In using audit sampling for exception rates, the auditors wants to know the most the exception rate is likely to be, rather than the width of the confidence interval.
Okay, for the fifth, sixth, and seventh part will be presented by Gina.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. And I'm gonna present the fifth part about non-statistical sampling in tests of control and substantive tests of transaction. Non-statistical sampling. There are three phases when sampling for tests of controls and substantive tests of transaction. The auditor must first plan the sample, second, select the sample and perform the audit procedures, third, and evaluate. Audit of Hillsburg Hardware Company is an illustration of the step of the following discussion. First, plan of the sample. For the plan of sample, there are 5 steps. First, take the objectives of the audit test. Second, decide whether audit sampling applies. Third, define attributes and exception condition. Fourth, define the population. Fifth, define the sampling unit. Next. 6, specify the tolerable exception rate. 7, specify acceptable risk of over-reliance. And 8, estimate the population deviation or exception rate. And 9, determine the initial sample size. Then we must select the sample and perform the audit procedures. The first step is select the sample. Second, perform the audit procedures. Third, evaluate the result. Fourth, generalize from the sample to the population. Fifth, analyze exception. And sixth, decide the acceptability of the population. Next. And 6, specify the tolerable exception rate. 7, specify acceptable risk of variance. 8, estimate the population deviation or exception rate. 9, determine the initial sample size. And next, we must select the sample and perform the audit procedures. This step is select the sample, perform the audit procedures, and then evaluate the result. The steps are generalized from the sample to the population, and next analyze exception, and then decide the acceptability of the population. Next part is part 6, about define and describe attributes, sampling, and a sampling distribution. Next. The attribute samplings is the statistical sampling method most commonly used for tests of controls and substantive tests of transactions. The sampling distribution is a frequency distribution of the result of all possible samples of a specified size that could be obtained from a population containing some specific characteristic. The sampling distribution allows the auditor to make probability statements about the likely representativeness of any sample that is in the distribution. And attribute sampling is based on the binomial distribution, in which its possible samples in the population has one of two possible values, such as yes or no, black or white, or control deviation or no control deviation. Next. The next part is part 7, the use of attribute sampling in tests of controls and substantive tests of transaction. Next. The steps discussed for non-statistical sampling are equally applicable to attribute samplings. In this section, we focus on differences between the two sampling methods. For the sample steps, there are several steps. For the first one is state the objective of the audit test. Same for attributes and non-statistical sampling. Second, decide whether audit sampling applies. Same for attributes and non-statistical sampling. Third, define attributes and exception condition. Fourth, define the population. Fifth, define the sampling unit. Next. 6, specify the tolerable exception rate. 7, specify acceptable risk of overalliance. The concept of specifying this risk are the same for both statistical and non-statistical sampling, but the method is quantification is usually different. For non-statistical sampling, most auditors use low, medium, or high acceptable risk, whereas auditors using attribute sampling assign a specific amount such as 10% or 5% risk. The methods differ because the auditors need to evaluate results statistically. 8, estimate the population exception rate. Same for attributes and non-statistical sampling. 9, determine the initial sample size. 4 factors determine the initial sample size for both statistical and non-statistical sampling, such as population size, TER, ERO, and EPER. In attribute samplings, the auditor determines sample size by using audit software with a sampling model or tables developed by statistical formulas. Next. This show that the step of plan sample that I present before, the 9 point, and then we must select sample as the 10th step, and then perform the test, and perform the test number of exception in sample and actual sample size. Then we evaluate the result. For the evaluated results in the step 12, they computed upper exception rate, and then the result is in the step 14, decide the acceptability of population. Next. That's all my presentation.
Okay, that is the end of our presentation. I'm sorry if we made mistake here and there, but I hope you guys find it helpful. And if you guys have any questions regarding this topic, you can ask our group about the materials on the third meeting. And once again, I'm sorry if we made mistakes in here and there, but I hope you guys find it helpful and it helps you to understand more about the material itself. And thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.